Good morning again. How are you? Good. A few of you. Awesome. Fantastic. Happy Father's Day to you guys. As we think about Father's Day, as we come in some way, sometimes expecting a Father's Day sermon, I just wanted to say that this is not a Father's Day sermon. And so we're going to continue on with our series in praying with the prophets. But here's the good thing, though, right? As I try to, in some way, as I try to every single Sunday, I want to direct your attention to the beauty and the goodness of who God is. And if we could in some way grasp that, this actually may be the best Father's Day sermon that I could ever preach to you. So happy Father's Day. Open your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6, we're going to be looking at a little sliver of the ministry of the prophet Elisha. So as we continue on in the praying with the prophets, we're going to be looking at the prophet Elisha. If you don't know who Elisha is and you think I'm just missaying his word because it's actually Elijah, actually there is Elijah and Elisha. And so Elijah precedes Elisha, but Elisha receives a double portion of the blessing of Elijah. So if you're all tongue-tied there, ministry is that the prophet that we're going to read about today has an incredible ministry, and we only get a glimpse of it today. And what is foundational to what he's doing in this passage is prayer. Right? So here's one of the greatest prophets in all of the Old Testament, one of the greatest prophets of God, and what he recognizes is the need to pray to God on his behalf, because it is through the power of prayer that God responds. Let us not miss that, right? So 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 23 will be the little passage that we're in today. As we get started there, let me sort of ask a question, as many of you have sat down on a clear, dark night out in the country, if you will. Us city folks growing up in the city, we had to get out somewhere to go see the stars, right? Some of you who were raised in the country, you just stepped outside. But we would go out, we would set up a pallet on the ground or a tent or blankets or whatever, lay in the back of a truck just to gaze and glean at the beauty of the stars because it was a clear night, and we would in some way try to take in the beauty of those stars and be captivated by them. It is an absolute magnificent sight. In fact, it's probably indescribable. Think if you had a friend that was blind that was sitting with you, and you begin to try to describe in some way what a star is, and what you're looking at and what you're beholding, how would you describe it? How would you begin to say that there's these things in the sky that it is the brightest thing that you can imagine against the darkest thing that you can imagine, and it's they're small and they're all over the place and they're like billions of light years away, and how could you describe the beauty of something that's indescribable? The fact is, because your friend is blind, that he couldn't grasp that. And what if he said this? What if he said, because I can't see these stars or these things that you're creating in my mind, I actually, because I can't see them, I can't perceive of them, and therefore, I would say they don't exist. And so by his blindness, he's rejecting the beauty of something that exists, whether or not he believes in it or not. And I think what this sort of directs my attention to is the thought and the idea that often what we sort of miss in conversating about what actually happens in the fall and sin of Adam and Eve is this spiritual blindness. That we think we can see, or just because we can't perceive, he doesn't exist. Like what we need is God to help us and to reveal to us and us recognize that we're spiritually blind to the beauty of who God is. But if we could grasp the beauty of God, then it would change everything, including our prayer life. Let's read with me in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8. It says, once the king of Syria, now my text says Syria, yours may say Aram, it's the same place. Once the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, at such and such a place I shall set up my camp. But the man of God, that is Elisha, but the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware that you do not pass in this place, for the Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel sent to the place to where the man of God had told him about, that he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. And the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing. And he called his servants and he said to them, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? So he goes, which one of you is the mole? Look, I know there's a rat in here, and somebody's running out of here every time we meet to go tell the king of Israel what our next military strategy is. Which one of you is it? And they say, Lord, none. It's none of us. But it's Elisha, the prophet who's in Israel. He tells the king the words that you speak in your bedroom. He's the original NSA, right? He knows everything. So he says, he's the one who tells the king of Israel what you're going to do next. And he says, go and see where I may find him and seize him. And so it was told to him, behold, he's in Dothan. And so he sent his horses and his chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God, so this is Elisha's servant, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army of horses and chariots surrounded all of the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? And he said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And he looks at Elijah and goes, brother, there's two of us. There's thousands of them. And Elisha prays, right? Elisha prayed and he said, O Lord, please open the eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened his eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountains were full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha again prayed to the Lord and said, please strike these people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. And as soon as they entered into Samaria, Elisha again prayed, O Lord, open the eyes of these men so that they may see. So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were midst of Samaria. As soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, my father, shall I strike them down? Shall I kill them? He answered, and Elisha answered, you shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your own sword and with your own bow? He says, is that what you do with your prisoners of war? You just kill them? And he says, set bread and water before them, that they all may eat and drink and drunk. He set them. So he prepared for them a great feast. And when they had eaten and drunk, he set them on their way, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. There's a few things that I want us to see in this passage. One being, I want us to grasp sort of the understanding of what prayer, how prayer happens in this text. And then I want us to see that there are two primary parties that are blind. And so you have Elisha's servant that's blind, and then you also have the armies that are blinded. So what's going on in this text? So you have the king of Syria who is warring against Israel. We don't know why. We don't know what the context is there. And so they're coming against Israel, and this king is gathered together with his commanders, and he begins to say, hey, this is where we're going to set up a camp. And we're going to kind of strategically come around them, and we're going to attack them from this area right here. And when he gets there, Israel's already there. He's a little confused. And so he does it again, and Israel's already there. And so the king of Israel already has sort of the idea of what every move that the Syrian king makes, the king of Israel already knows. And so he wants to know who's the rat, who's the one that's going out and leaking the information about what the next step's going to be. And it's no one, it's Elisha. God has been revealing to Elisha, so Elisha goes and he tells the king of Israel where they're going to be. And so he gets mad about what Elisha's doing. So he's thinking, if I can just go capture the man of God, if I can just go capture this guy, then everything else will be set in place. So we'll be able to do what we want to do. But that doesn't happen. So the servant of Elisha wakes up and he sees that he's surrounded by the armies. His circumstances are so weighing down on him. He realizes that his back's against the wall, and he cries out to Elisha, what are we going to do? Elisha says, don't be afraid. Don't be terrified. those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And again, as you can imagine, the thought and the look that's on this guy's face. And he's thinking, what in the world are you talking about? It's me and you surrounded by thousands of armies. And he opens his eyes and he begins to see that actually the spiritual forces and the armies of the Lord are surrounding those who are surrounding them. And then they rush down onto Elisha, and his servant Elisha prays for them to be blind, and they're blind. But here's the interesting thing. He then leads them into Samaria, where the king of Israel is stationed, right? They're camped out in Samaria, so he brings them before the king. There, their fate should have it. They're doomed. They're before the king, and instead of this blindness, though, that's on them is a very interesting blindness, because they probably weren't physically blind. They're probably just delusional. Because if they were physically blind, they probably wouldn't enter into and go look for and continue to look for the guy that they were looking for. It's probably more of a delusional that they thought that they were looking for Elisha, but that they were kind of confused. That's not really Elisha. Elisha's going to take them to the one. So they're sort of delusional about what they were actually doing, what was actually going on. Which is very interesting, because they thought they saw the truth or what they were looking for. They really weren't. They were looking for something else. In this blindness, they thought they knew what it was that they were looking for, but they were actually looking for something else. Very interesting. We'll get there in a minute. First, this is what I want to show you is this, that here's Elisha with his servant, and his servant is fearful of this battle or this fight that's fixing to ensue because they're outnumbered. It reminds me, and I think it would remind you a lot of what Apostle Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 6, when he says that it's not against flesh and blood that we fight, but it's against the authorities and the rulers and the evil spirits, the cosmic realm in the heavenly places. What Paul says is, look, it's not about flesh and blood. Is that there's a greater fight going on around you. There's more to this picture and this story than what you can actually see. Look, it looks like the world's coming against you, but it's not really the world. There's a bigger fight going on. But then Paul goes on to say, but be prepared for the battle. Be prepared for the battle. And how do you get prepared for the battle? You put on your armor. You put on the armor of God. What is the armor of God? You put on the helmet of salvation. You put on the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the belt of truth, the sword of the Spirit, and the feet of readiness. Like, be ready to go to war. Be ready to fight. Be ready to whatever comes against you that is wicked and is evil. You be ready. But then what's very interesting about what Paul does in all of chapter 6 of Ephesians is he preps this big picture that, like, everything's about to happen and you're fisting to go into war. But then he says in verse 18 something that's very interesting, and I love how the ESV does it because they keep it all in one paragraph. Paul says in verse 18, so all of that, get all your armor on. The next verse he says this, pray at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. Pray at all times in the Spirit with prayer and supplication. Here's what Paul says. Look, you need to have these things to be ready to go to fight. But here's the deal. The ultimate victory is won in prayer. And this is exactly what Elisha is tapping into, and he recognizes it. He says, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be terrified. Because we can pray. Because God is for us, and therefore, who can be against us? Because we have more on our behalf than they have on their own. And so what he realized was that there was victory in prayer, and Paul himself said the exact same thing in Ephesians chapter 6. That's good. There's a quote that I've heard recently, and I couldn't track down who said it, so let's just say he's a lot wiser than I am, so I'll quote him. But he said this, when man works. But when man prays, God works. When man works. But when man prays, God works. That, look, the power is not in us in some way, and Elisha going, hey, man, we're about to tuck tail and run. Hey, go to plan B. Hey, pull your sword out because we're about to go to fight. Whatever it is. That's not what he does. He prays. He prays. Look, we can work all we want on our own behalf. We can, in a lot of our circumstances, when we feel like we're surrounded by the enemy, when we feel like the weight of the world is coming against us, when we feel like our marriage is falling apart, or our finances, or there's more month at the end of the money, or whatever it is, when we feel like we're battling cancer and we can't get out of sickness, or whatever it is, it's not that we work on our own behalf. It's that we have someone who works on our behalf. And then we pray. The ultimate victory is in prayer. It's in prayer. When we can remove the scales from our eyes to see the beauty and the power of who God is, and we'll begin to pray. Here's another interesting thought, though, about this young man here. And I sort of labeled him as a believer, right? Here's why. Because he's of the nation of Israel. He's of the people of God. He's would be a God-fearing man. He would have faith in Yahweh. He is a servant of the prophet of God himself. He knows who God is. He worships God. Yet, in this moment and circumstances of his life, he doubts the goodness of God. See, the essence of all of sin, we see this in the garden, the essence of all of sin is when man doubts the goodness of God. When man doubts the goodness of God. What he lost here, what he thought here, what he was missing here is the steadfast love of God had forsaken them. He was thinking he was abandoned. He was thinking that God had forsaken them. He was thinking that God was nowhere to be found. He doubted the goodness of God in his life. And because of that, he was terrified amongst his circumstances. For both believers and unbelievers, this is it. This is the essence of it, is that we tend to doubt in our circumstances the goodness of who God is. Unbelief in itself is doubt and rejection of God and his goodness. That if you're in here this morning, you would describe yourself in a way of an unbeliever or have disbelief, then you would have some sort of understanding that you would think that God he's ultimately against you, that he has oppressive rules, that he just wants to hinder what you think is best for your life, what you think is good. God is not good, therefore what he wants for you is just going to hinder you for what you ultimately want. Right? So you believe in all aspects of life that you think your ways are better than God's ways. You think your ways are better because they're good. So you think what you want about sexuality or money or marriage or social justice because you think that they're better than God. We do this as believers as well. I mean, look down in verse 15 with me. Believers, on the other hand, they reject the goodness of God because they feel like they have to in some way work to earn God's favor, work to earn God's love for them because they lose sight of that in light of their circumstances. Look in verse 15 when he says this, and the servant said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" If he had been pondering over God's goodness and God's love for him, then he would know that God would rescue him and come on his behalf. But because he's lost sight of that, he felt like that he had to come do something, that he had to offer something up to in some way impress God. I think this idea of what shall we do has become the motto of the church. Thinking that we have to do something for God to love us. We have to do something for God to have favor with us. This idea of guilt of sin that draws us to Christ has now shifted to a guilt of works. That when we get saved, we have to now become some sort of impression on God that wants him to hang around us or be around us or something. Our idolatry just shifts. That's all it does. Martin Luther once said that our good works are a defense against the goodness of God. Circumstances. That we are seeking a goodness and satisfaction that only God himself can fulfill. And this is why we get so frustrated in prayer. Right? This is why we get so frustrated and oftentimes quit praying because we expect God to act on our behalf the way we want him to because we think we know what is good. And Justin used the term earlier of entitlement. We think that because we do something right, that we are entitled for God's favor. Therefore, God should do something for us because we do something for Him. So when we approach God in prayer and we don't get what we want, our question is, God, do you not love me? Are you not a good God? Because you didn't respond to prayer the way that I think you should respond? I'm not sure how many of you could say that God answers your prayers like He answers the prayer of Elijah. Listen, in this moment of Elijah's life, he doesn't need God to delay in prayer, right? So many of you are probably thinking, why doesn't God work for me that way? When I just pray, it happens. Let me bring your attention to another story in the text in the Bible. If you go to verse 13, you'll notice this word where he's going to seize Elisha, and Elisha's in the city, and the city is what? Dothan. $1 for anybody who can tell me where the last place that Dothan was mentioned in the Bible, the only other place that it is mentioned in the Bible. Justin raises his hand because he was in the first service. It was in Genesis chapter 37 where there's a man named Joseph there. And Joseph, if you remember Joseph's story, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. I can only imagine the prayer of Joseph that cried out for God to deliver him from slavery. And you know what? God does, but He delivers him into prison. And I can only imagine when he's sitting in the prison cell and he begins to cry out for God to deliver him from prison. And God sends 2 people from the king's court into his presence. And he's thinking with a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they're going to go tell the king and they're going to get me out of here. Yet years go by and that sliver of hope and he is all forgotten about. Yet finally he's delivered out of prison after all these years of being bound and chained, and God places him in a place where God needed him God wanted him because He had a purpose and a plan for Joseph. Not even a purpose and a plan for Joseph. He had a purpose and a plan for God's glory to continue the narrative of Scripture throughout the history of time. See, if God would have answered ultimately the prayer that Joseph wanted, or we would have wanted in Joseph's shoes, to be delivered from prison, what would have happened is that all of the nation of Israel would have, even though he was, but because God used Joseph and used his circumstances, even though he was crying out for deliverance to God, God had a purpose and a plan for him. So does that mean that when Joseph was in Dothan, that the armies of the Lord weren't there surrounding him and were willing to work on his behalf? No. That's not what that is. That doesn't mean that. Absolutely God was. But just because God doesn't act and respond the way we expect Him to doesn't mean that God is not good and we miss in some way the beauty of who He is. So just because your prayers aren't answered the way you expect them to be or want them to be or what you think they should be, doesn't mean that God is not in some way working this out on your behalf. In fact, Martin Luther says it again like this. He says, like a child trying to push against the hand of a parent, so God resists us in prayer to see our resolve in His goodness. That sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers right away or delays or doesn't answer them at all because God ultimately wants to draw us deeper into understanding who is right and who is good. That we go through the things that we do because God wants to deepen our faith and our understanding of who He is. Believer, you can be sure this morning that God is fighting for you by constantly fixing your gaze upon the cross, where He waged war against the world for you. Fix your eyes upon the cross and you'll see that God has already been the victor on your behalf. That God has already ultimately been good and has given you all that you need because He has poured His wrath out on the cross. The next half of the story is the blindness of those who are enemies of God or enemies of Israel. So they begin to rush down the hill or the mountains and they come to attack Elisha. And Elisha prays that God will blind them, so he does. And at that moment, Elisha begins to take them and walk them to Samaria, which is about 12 miles, about 3 hours walk into the presence of Israel. So when they get to the presence of the king of Israel, they're standing there, and if you could imagine, the blindness is removed, and they all of a sudden, wrong place at the wrong time. That they're doomed. That their punishment that they had coming is coming for them. That now the king of Israel is going to pour out his wrath, and he's going to wipe them out. Yet he doesn't. This rings of a representation of who Christ is, who came on this earth, was sent by the Father to. They missed it. The Jews were looking for a political leader to deliver them. The Romans were looking for some magnificent Caesar to lead them. The Greeks were looking for a philosopher king to give them wisdom. Yet Jesus comes as a carpenter, dies on a bloody cross on the hillside, and they all missed it. They missed it. Yet Jesus, much like Elisha, says, what you're looking for, what you're ultimately looking for right now is the man I'll lead you to. So you think that you need to capture the man of God so that you in some way have this blessing, but here's the blessing. When they were captured by the man of God, right, ironically, that's when they received the blessing of God. So he leads them into the presence of the king. And so it is that with Jesus, he leads us into the throne or the judgment seat of the Father. And where our fate is set before us, our doom is there, where we will have his punishment poured out upon us. And he says, should I kill them? Shall I destroy them? Jesus says, no, not at all. But set the feast before them and welcome them to the table. Jesus himself poured out his flesh and his blood so that we may feast upon him and come to the table. That we were before the throne of God, yet Christ has interceded on our behalf, just like Elisha did. The last verse I think is very interesting. I don't want to miss this key text. It says, and the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. Who were the enemies of Israel, who were the enemies of God, were ultimately turned into allies. See, what happens in this text is those who are enemies become allies because they've been reconciled. We are the enemies of God. We are the ones at odds with God, and because Christ has brought us in, so it is that we can become an ally of the Lord and be reconciled to him. We just sang the words, before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, the great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. This is what Christ has done on our behalf. The scariest moment in all of this, and talking about blindness, is this. That you think that you can see because you think you know what's best. But really, your perception is blinding you to the truth. That just because you think you know how things should be or what should be right, actually reveals to us that you are blinded to the truth. Jesus actually picks up on this idea in John chapter 9, verse 41. Speaking of the Pharisees, just having healed the blind man. He says, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. What he was saying is, you think you've got it all put together. You think you've got it all figured out to the point that you're not blind and you don't need God, but that actually reveals that you're blind. You miss the truth of God because if you would recognize your blindness, then you would receive the truth. The scariest part of all of this is when we think that we're not blind. So here this morning, we are trying to, in some way, capture what we think will get us the blessing of God. we are trying to capture what we think is right. But it's not about us capturing, it's about us being captured, just like these blind men were. That when we are captured by God and feast upon His grace and the salvation that He has sent through Christ, then our spiritual blindness is removed and we can seek the truth. Every head bowed, every eye closed this morning. There's two applications to this point. There's two prayers here. One, if you're a believer, you're still blinded to the things of God even in your circumstances. So just because we believe in God and trust in God doesn't mean that we don't doubt God's goodness and His beauty at times of need. So this morning, I'd ask you and encourage you, let your prayer this morning be that God would reveal to you His goodness amongst your circumstances. That you would see the beauty of God even amongst your circumstances, whatever that may be. But if you're here this morning in unbelief, maybe even not even realizing that you think you have it all put together. You think that your ways are the best ways. You think that you're ultimately good. And you need your spiritual blindness to reveal to you, to be removed, and God to reveal to you His goodness.